It was a cool conversation.
Which I thought was just shocking.
Thank you, brother, for coming on this today, and it's been just an amazing journey, actually studying more of the stuff that you've been talking about, which is absolutely extraordinarily shocking. It's unbelievable what they've been doing to humanity. And as we will see, we've been poisoning, or the doctors, these Satanist doctors, with no heart, for hundreds of years, have been deliberately poisoning the population. And this was like preemptive to what's been happening here with COVID. So it was all like test runs to get the psychological thing, the target markets that they're going to inject or they're going to poison, as you'll see with arsenic, liquid mercury, and other stuff that they called by different names at that time, but as we now know, are horrendous poisons. So let's go on with this. If you, I have to say this, please like, subscribe, comment, etc., and help to get the ratings up on these videos. The next video I'm going to be releasing is around Freedom of Information Act responses from major governments and some of the major institutions, where this lady, Christine Massey, God bless her, has amassed this collection of over 200 Freedom of Information Act requests. And that's going to be the third edition or the third episode. So here we are, number 2 right here. Please like and subscribe. It's great to have you here. And I have like little exercise tips in the middle of here to take breaks. Exercise, in my opinion, as a health coach and somebody who's been working in the health field for privately, not publicly, privately, for 44 decades. And look at this. The sun is just coming up. It's just topping the hills here and on my face. Look at it. I'm going to spin around again. Oh, what a beautiful dawn. It's going to be a beautiful day. So, I'm sure I've got lots more to say, but look at that sunrise in the meantime and enjoy those beautiful morning rays, those reds that are so important to activate the retina and the whole cascade of hydrocarbon tweaking that these red rays do. So, that aside, I'm sure we got some of that on the video too, so that will be helping you to activate and look at this shadow that we're getting behind me, which will quickly diminish. And there's my partner Lindy sitting down there. She's been a sound and an editor and for German TV back in the day when they did film and what was it, 16 millimeter and all the complicated stuff back then. So, without much further ado, let's go deep dive and look at these shocking statistics and the records that Roman has put together again. I've listened to this podcast many times in terms of editing it and creating shorts out of it, and every time I listen to it, it's like these guys have been at this genocide, this world genocide agenda for, well, certainly hundreds of years. And if you look at it in terms of every war is a banker's war, it's been thousands of years. So, and I think the only way around this is to get enough people connected into the truth that they can really focus on the future vision that that we need to create for this planet. So instead of looking over our shoulder at the past and the history of the bullshit that's gone on and using that to predict our future, we need to own this in ourselves and own this strategy of creating powerful visions, just like health coaches and all of the different coaches do.
It was a cool conversation we had about two weeks ago. And Roman jumped in with, some hard-hitting facts around virology, basically, but around contagion as well. And his investigation of and graphing out the U.S. vital statistics, the green books. And then he went back to England from 1838 and did a similar investigation and wrote a book on it called Dissolving Illusions. Am I correct on that, Roman?
That is correct.
Okay. Yep. So maybe you'd like to fill us in on what got you going on this, and then into the nitty-gritty of those statistics, which are quite shocking.
Sure. Well, sir, where are we going to start? Okay. I had young kids at the time. I had already gone through my kind of a health awakening because my health was not good in my later 20s into early 30s. And I had changed my diet. And so that kind of got me interested in nutrition and alternative medicine and things of that nature. And I was listening to various radio programs out of New York City because I'm in Connecticut. And they had a bunch of different guys on the radio. And I ended up listening to a bunch of different radio programs. And I ended up settling on the Gary Null show. And he was a health guy out in New York City. And he would have lots of different topics. And once in a while, he would have things on vaccination and autism, something I didn't, never really thought about much. And he would talk about that kind of stuff once in a while. And I would get kind of disturbed by it because I knew vaccines had saved us from plagues. And at least this was my thinking at the time. And, I was kind of concerned that you could still have neurological damage or autism, and that's what they were talking about. But I thought on balance, it was, more or less kind of worth it because otherwise we would have millions of people dying, and thank goodness for vaccines. But, that's kind of the unfortunate consequence of having these vaccines. And I thought there were smart guys working on making them better so we wouldn't have those problems. But, it got me curious, so I started reading more books, and I came across a little booklet, green booklet by Neil Miller, and I was paging through it, and I saw a chart in there that said there was a 95% decline in mortality before the measles vaccine.
So hang on here. This is really important for us to grasp.
Yeah, they had a little chart started in the year 1900. And it all went to the 1970s, and the vaccine was introduced in 1963. And by that point, from 1900 to 1963, the mortality, the death rate had dropped by 95%, according to his chart. It was a very rough kind of little chart. It wasn't, too detailed. And that struck me as, well, that can't be true because I kind of assumed that vaccines came along and stopped the death, not they came in after. So I thought the chart was a bunch of BS. I thought this guy was off his nut, basically. And I just threw the book on the side and just went about my day. But curiosity got the better of me. So I went to a local library after a few days and I said, well, let me see if this guy's, completely nuts. And I found a couple almanacs, and on the third one, I found mortality statistics for measles from 1900 and then 1910, 1920. And I put it on my little piece of graph paper, the 7 points or so, and connected the dots. And of course, now I'm dated because this was quite a few years ago when you would use graph paper. Anyway, I drew the lines, and I was like, son of a gun, it's about now down 95%. And I just sat there for the longest time. That was one of the moments you have like, aha, oh, wow, something, I didn't know something. This is really disturbing. I was quite disturbed by it. And I just sat there looking at my paper going, this can't be true. And, it was a real paradigm hit.
Because... So just before we go on here, it's very difficult for us to grasp the intensity of what you were going through, because, automatically we default to thinking, fallacious thinking around, hey, they're out to protect us, they're out to do us good. And you're saying that, now correct me if I'm wrong, and that I think what you're saying is that the statistics proved that the mortality rate was practically zero from the...
Well, according to this data, it was down 95%, which is pretty close. But, so just based on this simplistic chart, it was down 95%. So there's still some room for improvement. The point was, in my mind, was the vast majority of it was done, accomplished through other means, not because of vaccination. And honestly, I didn't know where I even got the idea that vaccines were what saved us. It just was something in my consciousness. Where that came from, I have no idea. I don't remember being taught that. I don't remember reading that. Something I just implicitly knew. Maybe because everyone got vaccines, so I just thought, that must be true. I don't know. Right,
hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, so the idea was there, and then this just kind of slapped me in the face. But being stubborn, I said, well, maybe this almanac's wrong. So I decided, where did they get this data from? And I didn't really know. But I would live near New Haven, and they have Yale Medical Library. So I went down there one day because I'm always innately curious. And I walked into the place, said, hey, can I use your library? I didn't know if they were going to let me in, but they said, sure, here's a sticker, put it on your chest, and you can go in and look at stuff. I'm like, oh, okay, great. I went into the reference area having no idea what to look for. And I saw these big olive green books called U.S. Vital Statistics. I was like, oh, must be in here. So I started paging through that, and I would find data. There was a whole series of books, probably like 50 of these things, or maybe less than that, but still there was quite a few. And you open them up, and they had all sorts of different things, marriages and all sorts of stuff in there. But they would have mortality statistics from diseases. And they were like a range from 1905 to 1907 or 1912 to 1920. They were all over the place. There wasn't one book with all this data. But I said, well, let me just photocopy each one of these. Of course, again, this is photocopying back then. So I photocopied all these pages that I thought were relevant of disease mortality in these various time frames. And I finished. I went home, and I had a spreadsheet because I'm an engineer by training. So I just threw in my Excel spreadsheet. And I was very careful to transcribe all the little data points correctly because they're all photocopied. I couldn't just cut and paste them, unfortunately. Right. And so I did that, and I realized I was missing quite a few years. So I went back and hunted those down, and I came back. I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 times I did that. And whatever. Eventually, I had all the data points. And so I had measles and whooping cough and smallpox and all these things. Not smallpox. They didn't have that there. Scarlet fever and things like that. And I was like, I don't even know what these things are. What's scarlet fever? I'd never heard of that before. I was like, I don't know what that is. Anyway, I didn't know anything about any of this stuff, but I knew that, data tells you what reality is, right? So I took the data, I had all the measles, I hit the chart button essentially, and boom, there was a new chart, much more detailed, but basically told the same story, except it was more detailed. So from the peak somewhere in the 1920s down to 1963, measles mortality had declined by 98%. Oh. So there it was. I was like, wow, that was pretty intense because you can't get better data than United States Vital Statistics. So I was just really stunned. How could we believe that vaccines saved us when something else must have been what really made the difference, and vaccines came in at the tail end? So why are they given all the credit? I just couldn't wrap my head around it. And then I charted...
Just as a point of fact here, Roman, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
So the vaccine data began to appear about what year?
Well, this is mortality statistics. So in the United States, it started in the year 1900 at the national level. states had other data, like Massachusetts, etc., started earlier, but at a national level was 1900 in the United States. So it wasn't vaccine data; it was just mortality statistics from all sorts of things, cancer and heart disease and every other thing you can think of, and infectious diseases were just a small part of that. And in beginning in 1900, they were a significant part of it, but by 1960s, they were almost just a very tiny portion of the whole mortality statistics. After I did the measles, I already had the data for whooping cough, so I did the same thing, and it was the same pattern. Mortality had fallen by 90%, 92% by the time they came out with a vaccine in the 1940s. They had a vaccine earlier. And what was interesting is the downward slope after the vaccine. There wasn't a big drop off. It just continued the same slope, the same momentum. It didn't change. There was no obvious, wow, we're saving lots of lives. It didn't change at all, which I thought was just shocking.
Right.
And so this whole thing got me very curious, like, why don't we know this? What did cause the massive decline in all these deaths? And so that just got me launched on this whole kind of investigation. I wasn't out to go find this stuff. It just kind of originally just kind of slapped me in the face, and then I just had to follow up on it and just try to understand it for my own benefit. And eventually I got data from England, and I don't really remember how I got all the data. Some of it I had to go to historical libraries. Somebody sent me a CD from England that had everything from 1900 on, which was a real pain because it wasn't just data. It was like broken up by age and everything else. So I had to like collate all the information using the spreadsheet. And then I got other data that started in 1838. There's some gaps in the data I never was able to fill in. But what was interesting is they had a much longer history in England because they started doing this kind of stuff in 1838, national statistics. And so what I finally got as much as data as I could, I charted that. So for measles. And what you would see is in the 1800s, measles was a big killer. And it really pretty much stayed a big killer. It would oscillate up and down until around 1875 or so. And it started declining. And it kept on declining and declining until in 1968, when they started vaccinating for measles, it had almost hit zero. It was very, very low. And so if you went from the peak in the 1800s to 1968, you had over a 99.9% or 99.8% decrease in mortality before there was a vaccine. So basically 100% down. I did the same thing for whooping cough, same pattern, big killer in the 1800s. Around 1875, it starts going down. And by the time you hit the vaccine, I don't recall the exact date when they started vaccinating for whooping cough in England, but by the time they started vaccinating, the mortality rate for whooping cough was already down by 99.7%. So basically, the problem was already eliminated before they started vaccinating, at least as far as mortality goes, right? Which you would think is the number one thing you want to, concern yourself with. Less people dying. It doesn't say you didn't get measles or you didn't get whooping cough, but the mortality rate had just dropped to almost nothing. And so that was even more of a shock because it was even more dramatic. So you had at least two countries showing this kind of massive decline before vaccination. And so you're like, well, why? Why are we doing this? And that's how I got started in all this, not because I had any kind of axe to grind and just have an idea that I want to, be contrary to the popular opinion. It just didn't make any sense to me.
Right. Kudos to you, Roman. It's like, that was an amazing discovery that you made. It reminds me of Christine Massey's work, where she's been doing the freedom of information requests to hundreds of countries. in hundreds of institutions, and none of them are able to prove that they are actually isolating the so-called virus in a sample. And of course, that is a whole another can of worms, which
yeah, sure, that's a different topic, really. But yeah, sure.
Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah. So 1838 was when England started putting the statistics together.
Yeah, they had London bills of mortality that started, I'm not sure, in the 1500s, but that's a different animal altogether. But at a national level, England and Wales started in 1838, and that was quite a big change for people to keep track of mortality statistics at a national level. So that was kind of a new thing, and England was leading the way on that. So they had a lot of the data.
So that you published, I believe, with Dr. Suzanne Humphries, a co-authored the book. 10 years ago now, is it?
That is right. Yeah.
And
2013. It feels like yesterday, so it's kind of funny.
Right.
Yeah, we.
And what was the title of the book again?
Dissolving Illusions.
Okay, so now, a decade later, you've got another version coming out with a companion to it. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the updated version, we're still hashing that out, but it's got some new charts in there and some new information on smallpox and some new information on polio and kind of a rework of whooping cough. So there's more information in there. And the companion, I think it's around 500 pages now, has hundreds of doctors' quotes. We're under the perception that the smallpox vaccine came out and doctors jumped on it and said, oh, this is the greatest invention ever. But there were hundreds of doctors that realized it was ineffective and deadly. So there was hundreds of doctors talking about that. There was also hundreds of doctors saying that medicine overall was deadly and that had caused enormous death and destruction. So there weren't just a couple of doctors, there's quite a few.
Right.
And
I remember coming across Beauchamp's work on viruses and contagion. And that was, I don't know, probably 15 years ago that I came across his work. And that was like a real eye-opener and a substantiation of the germ theory myth story.
Most of these guys were they started out because they were indoctrinated into the pro-vaccine camp, and the only vaccine back then was smallpox. They didn't have anything else. That started in 1798, but somewhere actually even in the beginning, 1805, 1810, 1820, there were doctors that were looking at this stuff and going, "Well, this is not safe. I know plenty of people are injured or killed by this." And it's not effective because after they got the so-called vaccine, which wasn't just a vaccine, it was made of many different things. But, once they got that, they weren't protected from smallpox. They still got smallpox. And so there was just a complete fallacy that this was safe and effective. It was neither. But the problem is it quickly got embedded to the medical ideology of the time. And it quickly became embedded into laws very quickly. And because it became, so embedded, no one could get rid of it. No one could challenge it. Even as early as, 1800, 1801, it was too late. It was already embedded. And so this thing persisted despite being a failure because it was just an ideology. You just couldn't stop. So the majority, more or less believed it. So therefore it continued, even though the data would show that it was a complete, utter failure. But that part of history is erased. So it's very interesting. So you have all these doctors talking about that. You also, in the companion, we have hundreds of stories of people being injured by vaccines, injured or killed, horrible, serious injuries. So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that that's in the companion so that people can use that, and it's fully referenced. There's hundreds and hundreds of references. I read way too many of these books and way too many articles from the 1800s, and 1700s, and even some from the 1600s and early 1900s. The amount of information that's there is mind blowing. I can't.
Right.
You would spend a lifetime reading all this stuff, but the interesting facts in there is just mind boggling. So yeah, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that we uncovered, and there's a timeline there of from late 1600s all the way till sometime in the 2000s of different things that you probably don't know in the timeline, and it's all fully referenced. And so you get to, kind of try to piece together in your own mind what happened over time. So that's in the companion as well. So I find all this stuff really fascinating because it doesn't fit almost anybody's narrative of history, even though it's all from history. It's all there, and anyone could have uncovered this. It's as these doctors challenged the paradigm for vaccination in the 1800s, it didn't end well for them ever. They were either ignored or they were ostracized and tossed to the side. So many doctors noted that it doesn't matter if you were a professor in a university and you were really well respected for history. As soon as you said anything against vaccination, you were no longer welcome. You just were kicked out. They didn't, so they could see that anytime anybody challenged it, they were just trashed or just basically ignored. And it's the momentum of this idea. And it's not the only idea that was really dumb. There was other really bad medical notions of the time, like bleeding people. They bled people all the time for everything. They also gave them mercury and arsenic and other toxic, materials to, supposedly help them get better. And these were all toxic and they made people sick, but they didn't understand that it did. You can read their journal articles. They thought it was a great idea, but some doctors realized these things are deadly. These are not good. And so there was all sorts of bizarre notions that they had. They also had something called the hot regimen. So if you were sick, say with smallpox or something else, they would put you in a room. No fresh air, no fresh water, keep you under lots of blankets, keep you super hot. The idea was to sweat it all out. And they thought any water was death, so they wouldn't give you any water, but they might give you a teaspoon of mercury. They would call it calomel. Yeah, calomel was a big thing. That was a big treatment for everything. And they would give you some of that. And, not surprisingly to me, a lot of people died because of the treatment, not because of the disease. And there's doctors that recognize that, but they just never really gained any traction.
Right.
So there's all sorts of wrong-headed notions, and no matter who found these things to be, not very smart. They just kept on going on. So there's a particular momentum in human psychology that keeps these things alive for decades or centuries, even though they should have gone away. So, which is interesting when you read all the history. It's like, wow, this is just crazy stuff.
Right. Crazy. Yeah. Crazy. Wow. So in your investigation, how comes that somebody came up with giving people mercury or arsenic? I mean, who were these guys? Where were the clinical studies? What was the methods used in the study?
None of it. So none, I actually don't know when they started using mercury. I think it was even further back in time. So I don't know who started that kind of stuff. I know who started inoculations and that kind of thing, but there's never any studies like you would think of, like, hey, we're going to give group A this and group B nothing, or placebo or something. Nothing like that was ever done. It simply was, they would call it empiricism, just an experiment. They would just try it, and they would try it on the public. And the reason they could get away with it is because people kept doctors in high regard. So they figured, well, it's a doctor. They know something. So therefore they would do whatever the doctor told them. But every doctor had their own little way they did things. Some did this and some did that. But there was no like really understanding of what was going on. It was all experimental. So they would try all sorts of toxic notions, and if the patient died, they died of the disease and not of the problem. Not of they died of the disease, not of the treatment, which was actually not true. Many people died of the treatment, and I think that's why we had such high mortality. There's a couple of different reasons why we had high mortality rate for smallpox and measles, etc., is because of the treatments and the environment that people lived in, and their health was atrocious generally, especially of the poor or lower middle classes who did all the work, who lived in horrible conditions with no sanitation, no fresh water, often in hugely polluted environments, because the only thing they had to heat with was coal or do any kind of manufacturing. So coal air, coal smog was all over the place. They had to work ridiculous hours. Even children as young as 4 were in mines and factories, and their food was often rotten. Remember, there's no refrigeration. There's no place to put food. So you just kind of hung up meat in windows and no screens. So it was just a horrifying, way to live. And so they were malnourished. They no doubt had, massive vitamin D deficiency because they didn't get much sunlight. Their exercise was like near zero. Their fresh water was zero. Their food was rotten. And they were overworked and stressed to the max. So no one could be healthy in that environment. Plus, then the medical men would come, because they're all men. There was no women doing this at the time. Medical men would come in and they're like, well, you have this, so now here, take some mercury and do this and do that. And all these things were toxic and not helpful. So, and that went on for, forever. So they ended up in all sorts of different conditions and problems. So, right. And there were people that recognized that smallpox, and this might be shocking, but there were people that said, hey, smallpox is not a big killer if you don't do any mischief by physicians or nurses. And the father of English medicine, Thomas Sydenham, actually said that back in the 1680s. Mm-hmm. And he's considered the, English Hippocrates. And so he said, if you didn't, basically he's saying, if you didn't mess around with the patient, they're going to recover. They'll be fine.
Can you mention his name again?
Thomas Sydenham. Hopefully I'm saying it correctly. And so it's an interesting fellow. He had noticed that the poor people who couldn't get treatment often recovered from like smallpox. They didn't die, but the ones that got the treatment, they're the ones that died. So because at that time they were really using mercury and hot regimen, and you can imagine, getting stuck in a room and being covered with blankets and not getting fresh water. You're probably not going to do too well. But the ones that got the cool regimen, I think they still gave them mercury, but the cool regimen, almost nobody died. So there was one case where they looked at it. In one town, they were using hot regimen, so their death rate was like 1 in 30 from smallpox. But the cool regimen town was like 1 in 600. So, this particular treatment was quite deadly.
What year are you talking roughly?
1700s.
Okay.
But these crazy notions of bleeding and mercury and arsenic and strychnine, and these things were all, continued into the 1800s, and even into the early 1900s, they were still using calomel, which is mercury. And so they had these bizarre notions that were killing people, but the mortality statistics, reflected, gee, you died from smallpox. There's no medical error death. Just like today, if you go to the hospital and medical error kills you, you don't get checked off on the box. And the CDC doesn't keep track of medical error, even though that's usually the third leading cause of death and has been recorded as such for the last 50 years. It's just not written down that way. So statistics can be very deceiving. So if you see, oh, here's a smallpox death, well, that's because there was a microbe that killed him or killed her or killed the child or whatever, right? But really, was that the case? Was Was it because the person was malnourished, or the child had to work in a factory at 5 years old, or had no fresh water or polluted water, or was malnourished, or was, medically treated very poorly? That all gets buried into this idea that the person died from smallpox or from measles or whooping cough. So,
Right.
yeah, so a lot of people were dying from these medical treatments, and some people recognized that, we don't need to do these things. And if you treated things properly, you wouldn't die from smallpox. It was considered a mild disease, really, by a few doctors. There was an Isaac Massey, who was apothecary to Christ Hospital in England. And when they first started inoculating, he was like, why are we doing that? We don't need to do that, because in his 20 years of experience, there was like 5 or 6 children that died in his hospital from smallpox, which was and there was like 1 in the last 8 years when he wrote his paper. It wasn't like everybody was dying from smallpox. They were dying from the treatments. So if you treated them properly, there wasn't much of a problem. So he couldn't understand why this newfangled notion of inoculation that started in 1720, why are we doing that? He didn't call it inoculation. He called it incantation. He's like, this is totally not needed. And inoculation was brought back by this Mary Wortley Montagu. And the idea was, we're going to take some material from somebody's sore who has smallpox or died from a smallpox, and we're going to scratch it onto you to give you smallpox ahead of time so that you would be immune, and then you wouldn't have to get smallpox. So it was a way to inoculate you. That's the whole idea, to protect you in the future. And Isaac Massey and others thought this was a preposterous notion. But like every medical fad, it caught on. It took a while to catch on, but that took off as a way to protect people from smallpox, even though it was more than likely a mild disease. And what's interesting,
Wow.
by the 1900s, smallpox, which was a big killer through the 1700s and 1800s, by the early 1900s, smallpox was now again a mild disease, often confused with chickenpox. And that was one of the big shockers I uncovered earlier on. It's like there was medical journals writing about how smallpox was a mild disease in 1920, and actually earlier, like late 1800s, early 1900s. It was like, oh, it's a mild disease. It's just like chickenpox. Almost nobody dies from it. But the way public officials talk about smallpox now, it's like a deadly disease, and everyone's going to die. 1 in 5 people die. Well, they didn't in these various hospitals in the 1700s, and they didn't die in droves in the early 1900s. It became like chickenpox. It wasn't deadly, but you wouldn't know that because it's been mythologized as being this horrible, deadly, virus. But part of the statistics is it's not just about some kind of microbe killing you. It's also, what was your health state and how were you medically treated and what environment you lived in. So all those factors go into those mortality statistics. And that's the big kind of takeaway from these charts.
Have you done more recent mortalities since like 2019, 2020?
No.
Yeah.
I kind of stayed.
Yeah.
I kind of stayed away from that because it's not really history yet. So it is history, but it hasn't percolated long enough. And so I just stuck with the old. I stick with the older stuff because I think that's important, because once you find out that the basis of vaccination, which is based on smallpox, protecting you from smallpox, is filled with lots of holes and insanity, that if you understand the base is rotten, then maybe everything on top of it's rotten too. And, vaccination. So first they had inoculation, which was taking pus from somebody's arm and creating some incisions and sticking it in there to make you sick. It was to make you sick, but in a controlled way. So then you would be immune. That's the idea of inoculation. And that went on for about 80 years. And over those 80 years, smallpox deaths increased by 50%. So it didn't really work, but it was a medical thing that they were doing. And then by by the end of the 1700s, 1798, Edward Jenner came up with this idea because he had heard that milkmaids were immune to smallpox and they would get something called cowpox. So he decided, hey, I'm going to come up with the greatest idea ever. He just kind of got it into his head. He wanted to be famous. So he came up with this idea, which is basically the same idea. He took some kind of sore from a cow and scratched it onto a person with the idea you're going to be protected from smallpox. And he actually thought it came from a disease called the grease that came off of a sick horse's heels. And that somehow that went on the cow, and then the cow transformed it into cowpox and went from horsepox to cowpox. He also thought goatpox was the same thing. And over the next 100 years or so, people came up with different ideas of what this was. No one ever really knew. Some people thought it was from the horse. Some people thought it was from the cow. Some people said it was smallpox. You would take smallpox from a person, scratch it onto a cow, and then use that pus from the cow to inoculate people with this so-called vaccine. So you had all these different ideas of what a vaccine was, and no one ever really figured it out because it was just like mass insanity, and everybody had a different idea what it was. And so you had a variety of things that all went under the umbrella of vaccine when it was really just a whole bunch of mishmash of stuff from all these different animals. Plus they were doing arm-to-arm vaccination for 100 years, from 1798 to 1898. So they would take the pus from your arm and then do it to the next person, the next person, the next person. And that's how they were able to vaccinate huge numbers of people. It's not like today you went to the doctor and got a shot or something. They had to take a lancet, a sharp implement, and scratch you multiple times and take this material and squish it into your system. And that's what a vaccine was. But you never knew where it came from. It was just a mishmash of all these different things. And later on, when they looked under microscopes, they could see it was filled with bacteria and fungus and every other thing in there. But that didn't stop them from continuing to do it. So it was just this insane kind of thing to do. But they didn't understand that in the 1700s and early 1800s. And by the time it came to the late 1800s, they couldn't get rid of this bizarre notion. So that's what a vaccine was. It was just this mishmash of different animal pusses all mixed together from person to person to person to person.
Right. So on the Spanish flu, did you get to look at those figures?
I looked a little bit at the Spanish flu, and I didn't really dive into it too deeply. What's interesting about the Spanish so-called flu is that it hit younger people, not the children and not the old people, which is what usually a flu hits, right? It didn't hit them. It hit, healthy males more than anything else. The other interesting thing is they quickly turned blue and died. And another interesting thing is it happened all over the planet pretty much at the same time, which was very bizarre because there's no international travel in 1918. You couldn't get on a plane and spread a disease. You had to go by boat. So for it to appear in all these different places simultaneously, couldn't be an infectious agent because it was all over the place. And there's no way it could have been transmitted. So what was it? I doubt it was a flu virus. It was something else. I don't know what that was. There's different.
There's a book called The Invisible Rainbow.
Right. So there's right. Go ahead.
And in there he's proposing or putting out the point that those, like you mentioned, that how comes it's appearing all over the planet at the same time? Mm-hmm. And he tied in that Spanish flu episode from the use of radios, what do you call them, walkie-talkies, I guess, or the early big radios that they were using in the First World War trenches. And that they had altered the biome on those individuals so significantly. I don't think you mentioned biome, but to me it would appear that it altered the biome so significantly.
There's other theories too, yeah.
Oh.
One of them was that they were increasing these various vaccination inoculations of all sorts of different things they were concocting based on this whole idea of giving you some kind of disease. And they came up with so many different, notions that, the idea was they were inoculating a lot of these soldiers with these various concoctions, and that they got sick from the inoculations. But I really don't know. I couldn't find any definitive data on that. There was just some theories espoused, and there was some documentation, but that's a topic unto itself. I mean, you could spend probably a decade or 2 decades digging into all that stuff and trying to figure it all out. And I never did. So, but it doesn't smell like a flu, like a normal flu. They just gave it the name flu because they assumed it was a flu. And once they assumed it was a flu, then the name stuck. So I don't think that was a flu per se. I don't know what that was. Yeah, I could be wrong. I always preface everything. I could be wrong about everything. But, I'm very careful because I have an engineering training to try to get the data correct and get the data, all the quotes in the book are referenced. I'm very careful to make sure everything's spot on as much as I can possibly do. But, so in this case, it's pretty clear that it wasn't a flu, even though people might call it a flu. But, names can be very deceiving. So like vaccination in the 1800s wasn't, pus from a cow. It was pus from a horse, a cow, a goat. In India, they use buffalo. They also use sheep, and all these different things. And a lot of times, quite often, it was either from a horse or it was from people who had smallpox that they scratched onto a cow. So most of the time, it wasn't directly from a cow, and so it was just a big mishmash of stuff.
Well, thank you so much for doing such a deep, long dive into this research that you did and putting this knowledge out to us. I was you mentioned that when the original book came out 10 years ago, that it had a life of its own and took off despite everything else, and that was good timing, Roman. Good timing.
So I had all this data, I had all these charts, and I basically did it because I wanted to do the best I could for my kids, and I was just curious more than anything else. I wasn't out to write a book or change the world or anything. And, I kept on getting all this data. I had like these massive binders of data and articles I had photocopied. So I had all this stuff, and I was like, wow, I should really do something with this since I have it all. So I started writing a book, book number 1, but after a while I had life, so I threw it away. Then I restarted a second time, and I was writing some proto chapters, and I was trying to organize my thoughts on everything so I could, make sense of it all and explain it, right? And eventually I said, well, I really have to share this because I don't think anybody knows this stuff for some reason. I don't know why they don't know it, but I felt like I should write a book. But I also then, after a while, I thought, well, I really need a doctor to get on board because who's going to listen to just an engineer who doesn't know anything? So I knew I had to find a doctor, and I was, again, listening to, I think it was the Gary Null program. And I tuned in and halfway in the program or something like that. And I heard this lady talking about smallpox, and I was listening. Oh, I found my co-author. It was like one of these knowing things, which I'm pretty, factually based. So, knowing things is kind of like woo woo, but I still just knew. Anyway, so I gave her a call. She didn't return my call. Second call, didn't return a call. Third call, she returned my call, and she thought I was just a quackbuster giving her a hard time. But I said, no, I'm doing this project. And I explained what I was doing. And she said, well, why don't you come up to Maine? She was in Maine at the time, and we can, I can read some of your stuff and we can meet each other. I said, okay.
So this is Dr. Suzanne Humphries, correct?
Yeah, it was Dr. Humphries, right? So she was a nephrologist and well-respected nephrologist in Maine. And she had her own drama with vaccines in her practice. And she started digging into things too. So it was just kind of like the perfect timing to come together. And so she read some of my stuff, and she's like, I'm on board. Let's do it. And so we spent the next 4 years and published eventually in 2013 when we're both sick of it because we have 500 pages of stuff. We ditched like 10 chapters and said, okay, we got 500 pages of stuff here and it's really compelling. So let's just publish. And I published and I was like, I'm done. I don't want to do anything with this anymore ever again. I'm pooped. I was wiped out. And I thought, I'd sell a couple hundred books, something like that.
So let's fast forward to round this out for this talk together. And so now we've got the new editions coming out and your companion. Yep. And also you have been in checking out environmental stuff. And you have a book coming out, Moving Back from Midnight. Yeah,
that's already out.
Oh, okay.
And you can go to movingbackfrommidnight.com to look at that, and dissolvingillusions.com for the Dissolving Illusion stuff. And again, the reason I got involved in that was like 8 years ago, maybe more. I'm always curious about lots of things, astronomy and environment. And again, I was listening to radio programs and reading some books. And as I was listening to these various topics, I became quite disturbed about plastics and species extinction and things like that. And I thought, well, I wonder how bad it really is. So I started doing my own deep dive into all these different things. And every time I looked, it was a lot worse than I even thought. So after a while, I just started kind of writing things down, and I decided, well, maybe I should write a book about this too, because this is probably more important than diseases, because this is our very life support system of the planet. And I saw it being basically systematically destroyed. And so I decided, hey, let me see if I can put together information. And I always start a project like from neutral and try to be as neutral as I can and just gather data and see what, where it goes to. And, it was so horrendous. I decided I have to write a book about it. So that book is about 500 pages and over 1,000 references. And, it's quite disturbing. And, I think, we need to we as a, species, as a planet, need to refocus our away from these kind of medical notions that aren't serving us to, something where we, take care of the planet and get ourselves healthy. And they're all intertwined. If you're taking care of the planet, you're taking care of yourself. Things get a lot better, I think.
Right.
But we have gotten caught in these paradigms, that we need medicine for everything, which I don't think is true. And we need these shots for everything, which I don't think is true. And we can do whatever we want to the planet because we're people, and people can do whatever they want. And I think that's not true either.
Right. My motto is do no harm.
That would be good. And by the way, that's never been the case with medicine. Medicine's always been empiricism. It's always, let's try this. And they usually try it on the public. They've done that with everything. It's like, let's just try this. Well, I guess that didn't work. Let's keep doing it for a while longer. And then, oh, this one's better. Let's do this instead. And it's been like that for a long time.
Well, thank you very much. So again, your websites are dissolvingillusions.com. Am I correct on that?
That is correct. Dissolvingillusions.com and movingbackfrommidnight.com. Yeah.
Okay. And is that the best way for listeners to contact you, or?
Sure. Yeah. All the contact stuff's on Dissolving Illusions, email, Twitter account, and all that kind of stuff. Happy social media.
Are you on Substack?
Yeah. I'm actually working on a longer piece now. I usually write little pieces. I also have some YouTube videos. Some of them got taken down because they were naughty and didn't worship vaccines, so I got in trouble. So those got ripped down. But I'm also
I've had that.
So even though they were fully referenced, but that didn't matter to YouTube. But I'm also on Odyssey, so there's a little bit more of a free platform there. And so you can watch some videos. Everything's linked on to dissolvingillusions.com.
Okay. That's I take my hat off to you, brother. Thank you so much for doing all of this work over these years and sticking with it.
I always say I'm no one special. I'm just curious. And and I'm determined. Once I grab onto something, I'm like a pit bull. And so anybody can look this stuff up. Anybody can read these books from the 1800s and go, oh, wow, that's not what I thought it was. As a matter of fact, in the companion, I have a list of I think 40 or 50 books that you can go look up and you can read them. And you'll be surprised at what you read in there, because it's not what the homogenized history is. Well, actually, it's kind of fake history, really. And once you read that, you're like, oh, wait, this is not right. And with the companion, I'm hoping other people can write other books and go deeper dives into all sorts of topics and write their own books or make videos or movies or whatever they want, so that we can, kind of move forward away from this, primitive notion.
Wow, what a resource. Yeah, thank you, Roman. This has been really special to have you on the Fallacy and Idiocracy podcast today, because these topics obviously dovetail to what the podcast is about.
Yeah, and a lot of idiocracy went on through history and still goes on.
Oh man, yeah. And now we're totally ruled by idiocrats, but at least everybody can see it now.
Yeah, just as a note. So during the 1800s, across the planet, people were forced to get vaccinated. If you didn't do it, you were fined. You went to jail. It was really brutal, maybe even more brutal than today. So this is nothing new. Western governments aren't about freedom. They're about control. They've always been that way, and with a veneer of freedom on top. So they force people to do lots of things. And if you didn't like it, too bad. They would throw you in jail. You had no rights, when it came to these kinds of ideas. And they also, euthanized, wrong term, sterilized lots of people because of the eugenics movement, because you were inferior or you had whatever. And that ended up being taken up by the Nazis. And eventually that didn't end well. So, governments have done really crazy things over the years. So it's nothing new being crazy. So hopefully we can learn from that and stop doing these things.
Right. Right. And having people like you come out and really do dig deep and have the ability to dig deep into these topics. People need to wisen up and check your books out.
Yeah, that would be great. And especially environmental. Well, I guess they're both important, but the environmental books, so people there's tips in there how you can slowly change. If you read the information, it's compelling. Stop using certain plastics. Maybe stop eating fish because the oceans are collapsing. Think about what's going on with the tropical rainforest, species extinction. Make changes in your own life. It'll only make you healthier and happier. So why not do them?
Right. So let's get you back, and we'll talk about that in a future podcast.
Sounds awesome. Thanks for having me.
Okay, man. Yeah, well, it's my pleasure, and I'm so happy to have discovered you or discovered us, and
it's all good. Together. Excellent.
Yeah. Mahalo. All the best to you, brother. Hey, thank you for watching my podcast. And as you got practically to the end here, I assume that it did grab you in several ways. And please like and subscribe and get on my list, because this is what I intend to do, is to, expose these fallacious agendas and way of destroying logic, and destroying humanity's consciousness. And I'll be doing that in future episodes, sporadically, it looks like now. It takes me a lot of time to put these podcasts together. But in the next one, we're going to be talking about Freedom of Information Act requests, and with Christine Massey.
Be really clear what I'm asking for and what I'm not asking for. So I said I want any records of that alleged particle being pure.
Who has amassed a huge collection of Freedom of Information requests to different government and health agencies across the planet, asking for proof of isolation of a virus. And interestingly enough, well, kind of like tragically enough, this exposes part of the germ theory mythology, and how we've all been duped, because none of those universities and governmental organizations confirmed that there had ever been any isolation and purification of any virus ever in any of the work or any papers that they could cite. So that's going to be one of them. And then next is going to be around the legal recourses that we can personally take as individuals. That is also working, and actually I'll add this little tip on the end of Christine's FOIs. She's the FOIA queen, as it were. She did some requests of different government people, not the agencies, but them personally, to cease and desist around different activities that they were doing, and giving them just personal notices that this will go to federal court. And she's got some amazing results of that too, as have many others. And so that's hugely important when we hold the individuals and ourselves accountable to, you know, confronting these individuals as individuals, not masked behind a corporation or some other, quote, legal, but it's illegal, but it's called a legal structure of dead corporations, and how that has really affected us in many, many, many ways, and allowed us to be divided and conquered. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure putting this together to you. I've been swimming in the ocean this morning here in Hawaii. I'm at one of the beach parks, getting ready to go to the public library to do some internet stuff, and then off to my ukulele class. I've been just rehearsing here. And so, yeah, you know, if this is something that you're interested in, I am also writing a lot right now. I'm just getting back into the writing. I'm writing a book, High Attitude Hiking, my many, many hikes and sort of pilgrimages up on Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea, up to close on 14,000 feet, and learning those tricks that the mind plays when you're at those altitudes, and how, you know, to really set that mind in to be able to go up there at my age, 73. And, you know, fasting tips, which I do a lot of, nutritional stuff, and do a lot of, you know, not heavy exercise, but regular exercise. I kind of like gravitating towards the blue zone type diet, and it's been working for me. And, you know, other health issues, which of course I've had in the past, I'll be talking around that, and especially around microcurrent, and which is basically grounding, but is grounding on steroids, and hydrogen or hydrogenated water. And that's what I have actually in this bottle. I pass the hydrogen through this water in order to dissolve the hydrogen in the water, so that when you drink it, you're getting those hydrogen atoms into your body, and the water is way more liquid. It goes into the tissues a lot faster, and the hydrogen atom is a reducing, it's an anti-inflammatory, it reduces whatever oxidized state or matter that's in the body. And it's highly important because it's such a small element, and it's, I believe, the most prevalent element in the body, since it's H2O, and there's 2 atoms of hydrogen to 1 of oxygen, and water is supposedly, you know, 70 whatever % of the body fluid. So there we go. With the oceans behind me, the sun's coming through the thin cloud layer now, and it's going to be a beautiful day.
Where are my legs?
I hope yours is too.
My water bottle clanking in the background. I'm at 8,400, something like that. Maybe 3 now. Anyway, I'm going to take the camera in my pocket and get it back into the stride. Mahalo. Mahalo mana loa. Aloha mana kea. Into the volcano, into the magma, into the sun, connected to bam, bam, bam.
The other really important point is we've started doing requests on other alleged viruses as well. So I have quite a collection on those now as well, like dozens of other alleged viruses, just to help show that they don't have proper scientific evidence for any alleged virus. And